Welcome to the Trans-Apocalyptic Oasis show, where we transcend and include the apocalypse. And I am here with Jared Morningstar, who is the son of Lucifer Morningstar. Welcome to the show, Jared.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
I'm just kidding. He's not related to Lucifer, I don't think.
I'm adopted, so who knows?
Ooh, okay. So, yeah, sorry it took so long for us to get together. I just wanted to grow this epic beard first. Um,
Good call.
yeah, you like it?
Very nice, very nice.
Yeah. I think this could pass for like a Muslim beard.
You got to shave the upper lip if you really want to get the trad look going. But you could come off as a little Amish then too, so you got to be a little careful.
So I'm supposed to shave my mustache, huh?
Yeah, at least trimmed. At least trimmed is sort of the widely accepted sort of prophetic standard that has been set and passed down. But it's optional. Many would say recommended, but optional. So
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. So, no, but actually, okay, so I'm looking extra Muslim today because, well, you're our first Muslim guest here, and that's helping our diversity quota. Because so far, I think it's been mostly, Protestant white males, and while you're still a white male, at least you've got some religious diversity. But then you're also like a process philosopher, right? Or theologian.
yeah, it's a major sort of strand in my thinking nowadays, certainly, and also my income source. So gotta represent.
Wow. Okay, well, since you can make money from it, I definitely want to hear more about it.
For sure.
So why don't you tell us what that means?
Process philosophy, generally. Yeah, process typically is this understood as this tradition in theology and philosophy that traces back to our boy Alfred North Whitehead, sort of 20th century mathematician, philosopher, kind of theologian. He did not use this term himself, process philosophy, process theology, at least not in sort of a major kind of standardized way. He
Right.
referred to his own thought as the philosophy of organism. And so he's really trying to get beyond a kind of mechanistic Cartesian-Kantian mode of thinking that has this sort of bifurcated nature, bifurcated mind body, these sorts of things. And he's trying to propose a new cosmology that is not based on sort of a substance metaphysics, but instead has sort of relation and experience as kind of the fundamental ontological realities that exist for things as small as subatomic particles, but certainly also conscious human beings. So he did some interesting sort of theological playing around in some of his later work that was then picked up by more kind of really theologically oriented thinkers after him. Charles Hartshorne being a major one, but there's certainly many in this tradition. And yeah, it's sort of alive and thriving today, both in philosophical and theological circles, contributing some interesting perspectives that cut against various philosophical and theological orthodoxies in certain ways. So
Interesting. So you're talking about like a experiential basis, like states, the
mm-hmm.
experience of states,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of being the basis of philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Which,
absolutely.
yeah, which is closer to like mystical experience and sort of how the mystics understand reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so what drew you to that?
Yeah, process. I'd say definitely. I was really sort of trying to go through and seriously study a number of different kind of 20th century religious or theological uh, sort of philosophies, these various schools of thought that were really kind of grappling with some of the kind of major problems of modernity and religion. And Whitehead is certainly one of those figures. There's certainly a Heideggerian sort of tradition as well. I'm very influenced also by the Japanese Kyoto school, who are very interesting sort of philosophers that bring together Zen and Mahayana Buddhist perspectives and all sorts of Western philosophical and religious material to really wonderful effect. There's this interesting school called the Traditionalist school. People like René, Guénon, Frithjof, Schuon, Seyyed Hossein Nasr that are very Neoplatonic, very much sort of looking at sort of the mystical heart of the various world religions as kind of ultimately pointing to some singular truth, et cetera, et cetera. So I was really trying to do some serious investigation into some of these different kind of lineages, and process seemed to be one of those promising options. So back in, I think it was early 2021 was when I really got into Whitehead and started to do a serious study of some of his thought, which has certainly continued to today, and now looked into many other of the contemporary and past process philosophers and theologians as well.
Cool. So let's switch gears here a little. So you converted to Islam. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a slow and meandering and sometimes nebulous sort of religious identity that I have for myself, but it is something I pretty proactively identify with at this point, though in a somewhat non-exclusive kind of way. I'm somewhat of a pluralist, but keep that to myself depending on what kind of company I'm keeping.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have some kind of Islamic framework or home ground that is kind of a constant touchstone for me with various philosophies and theologies.
I see. So what drew you to that?
Yeah, so just kind of biographically, I had a really excellent world religions class my freshman first semester at college. Really vibed with the professor, and well, he was the Islamic Studies guy at my little liberal arts school. So ended up taking a bunch of Islamic Studies courses with this professor, and that really kind of got me a little more deeply involved in the tradition. And he was the person who kind of showed me this traditionalist school that I was mentioning earlier. And so that was kind of the first of these major philosophies that I kind of really latched onto to a certain extent. But then that kind of puts you in an interesting position as someone with like a kind of cultural religious background up to that point, like raised Lutheran, but didn't have a sort of deep attachment to Christianity or Lutheranism, and kind of rejected that in teenage years for the kind of scientific atheism that was very in vogue in the like early 2010s. Thinking about the mystical unity of the world's religions as someone who isn't kind of already grounded in a tradition kind of leaves the door open to, well, which one of these lineages do I want to kind of participate in and engage in a bit more substantively, because part of this philosophy is also that kind of pushing back against this very modern idea of like being spiritual but not religious, that to really have a effective sort of spiritual practice, or to be really brought into these kinds of deeper realizations, one needs to participate in some kind of proven lineage that has contact with kind of authentic teachings, and ultimately some kind of divine or transcendent source. So
Yeah.
yeah, I was kind of searching around, feeling around, exploring a number of different traditions, and just with some of the kind of familiarity I had built with Islam through my studies, I kind of kept coming back to that in some way. Could talk a little bit about like some of the specific features of the tradition that I think make it particularly amenable to kind of what I want from a religious perspective in our contemporary times, if that would be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. What
Yeah, so I mean, we got well,
bells and,
one of the things. Oh, go ahead.
no, I said, what are the features, the bells and whistles that you like?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, basically, I think this is pretty widely understood about Islam, but we got a very sort of monotheistic religion here. We got the transcendent gods, certainly, very Abrahamic, closer to Judaism, probably in this sense than Christianity, as typical Christian theology does have this idea of the Trinity, which of course Christians themselves will say is entirely monotheistic, and there's really good and nuanced arguments for that. But it's a complicated system. So in Islam, we have this idea of Tawhid. That's the Arabic term. And it's basically the sort of fundamental unity, oneness of God. And that's kind of the starting point for Islamic theology, regardless of kind of what direction that takes from there.
Yeah, because there's like 99 names for God or something like that. And so
Exactly.
basically,
Yeah.
God manifests in different forms,
hmm
right?
hmm
But there is ultimately one sort of unification.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the kind of perennial discourses in Islamic theology is trying to parse the relationship between the divine essence, this idea of a singular unitive God, Tawhid, and then a God with attributes. This God has specific features. These 99 names. That there's certainly more than 99, but this is just kind of the buzzword, the catchy lingo,
Right.
that has some kind of mystical connotations. So yeah, it's very Neoplatonic, and there's certainly Neoplatonic forms of Islamic theology, and I think often those are the forms of the theology in the tradition I find sort of more convincing. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think very kind of rationalistic in a certain sense. Got one God. It's kind of straightforward, but then also there is this kind of more ready to hand relation between God and the world through this idea of the divine attributes. So when you are out in nature and sort of experiencing awe at some beautiful landscape, say there's mountains or something, well, you're sort of experiencing the being of the mountain, having its being through this sort of divine characteristic of, say, majesty is kind of one of these classic 99 names. So it gives a sense of a very sort of theophanic world in general. So theophanic meaning sort of God manifesting. So you can very easily see sort of the divine attributes in sort of the whole gamut of human and kind of natural experiences that are available. So I think kind of getting past that bifurcation of nature and whatever you want to call like the supernatural or something. I feel like Islamic theology is a bit more amenable to that in kind of a straightforward way. using some of these scriptural and traditional sources than I found Christian theology to be. In general, there's certainly effective ways that Christians have parsed this question too, but it feels a little bit more like a little bit of a theological gymnastics, where it comes very naturally in an Islamic framework, I find.
I got you. Yeah. Okay. So what is the nature of Allah?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, certainly one of the central questions in Islamic theology. I'd certainly come right back to that term Tawhid, unity, and I'd say that's probably the starting point for thinking about this question. But then the 99 names certainly throw open the door there. So I think the kind of unity that one finds in Islamic theological thinking is a unity that does bring together opposites in some kind of way that allows for them to kind of coexist, rather than trying to sort of synthesize that tension away. There's a classic way of categorizing the sort of divine attributes, the divine names, into names
Yeah.
of majesty and names of beauty. So names of beauty, you have things like Rahman, the compassionate, or the all compassionate, as it's sometimes translated. And in names of
Yeah.
majesty, you have things like the just, like the lawgiver, and things like this that have some rigor to them, have some it's kind of showing the sort of theological drama that kind of exists still. Like you're going to be taken into account by this God, and so you have these two sides that are kind of coexisting, but then at the same time, both of those are somewhat kind of relativized by this notion of just the sheer incomparability of the divinity. So if you think in very sort of classically theistic terms of kind of God as the ground of being, or the fount of creation, or things like this, what you're dealing with is not some all-powerful creature in some sort of transcendent plane that is kind of puppet stringing the cosmos, but kind of the sort of ineffable sort of ground of all things, and that which gives being to all of creation. So you can never kind of just kind of crudely apply any of these qualities and say, oh yeah, that's God. But at the same time, those qualities are considered to be sort of true reflections of a limited perspective. So it's complicated stuff, but I think that complexity is a feature rather than a bug. Being able
Yeah.
to hold these different attributes together and feel them, because certainly when we experience life, when we experience this world, we experience both these sorts of aspects of beauty and majesty, and there is real rigor and real sort of stress and strife that comes to the fore in our lives. So how do we see those as emerging from the one and the same source in some way? So
Yeah, I like that. And I've got a list of the 99 names, and I'm just reading through some of them and noticing which ones sound particularly intriguing to me. And the one that really caught my eye is Al-Ba'ari,
mm.
the evolver.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. And there's certainly some process theological connotations that can come out of that. That's a very cool one. Not one I'd been tuned into before. I'll need to look into that one a bit more. But yeah, I mean, wonderful that there's all these different qualities that certainly the Sufi mystics will sort of use these as sort of liturgical formulations, so you can recite and meditate on specific names to sort of encourage particular spiritual insights in related to that quality of existence and God. But yeah, the evolver, I do like that. There's this sort of classical Islamic theological doctrine called occasionalism, which actually had some decent impact on sort of Western philosophical history and development. And basically, this is a doctrine of kind of strong omnipotence, and it's a doctrine that very much goes against sort of intuitive perceptions of causation. So in this framework, you have a God that is sort of in each atomic moment of the cosmos, recreating all things anew, and so causation as it is perceived as sort of mere habit of God. So I could I mean, typically, if you like stick your hand in a fire, you're getting burned. That's obviously how that works. But in an occasionalist framework, there's a lot of possibility for like miracle or the sort of contingency of sort of scientific law. So you could maybe stick your hand in the fire and God would just decide it's not going to burn this time. So it's an interesting philosophy. But yeah, that kind of goes to show how these medieval Muslim theologians were thinking about sort of divine power as very much a bedrock of all created things and the causal developments. So yeah, it is totally God evolving the cosmos moment to moment.
I like it. And you know, my spiritual path is the diamond approach, or the diamond path now. Are you familiar with that?
Only very little bit. So yeah, if you want to clue me into some major features here, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, so there's a couple things I'm interested in talking about from it, but like one of them is there are these various boundless dimensions, these like non-dual that are like non-dual experiences of reality. But these dimensions of reality that you can experience, that sort of roughly correlate with ultimate realizations in various spiritual traditions. And I know you've got some experience with like Buddhism and maybe Advaita Vedanta. And so in the diamond approach, the absolute is considered like the most fundamental ground of being. And that's the mystery, um, from which all manifestation comes forth. And then there's this other dimension, the logos. The logos is the dimension of creative dynamism. And that is what's sort of creating reality all the time, moment to moment to moment. And so from the perspective of the logos, it's like it might look like this thing caused this thing to do this other thing, but really it's just like every moment is just being created and birthed anew.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what some of these names reminded me of, like the creator, the maker, the evolver. Um, Al-Ba'ari is the one who decreed things to exist out of nothing in a specific manner, creates shapes from nothing that has no model or similarity. He manifests his creations in perfect harmony and in perfect proportions without any faults. So yeah, that to me is sort of speaking to the logos dimension. And which also reminds me of this concept in, Christian theology, like Christogenesis, which is basically the biological and cosmological genesis of creation. So it happens to be my favorite dimension. Um, it sort of correlates with my Enneagram type.
Hmm.
You familiar with the Enneagram at all?
Very surface level, so I couldn't even tell you the
All right, good. I'm happy we don't have to.
meanings or the associate with the main types or anything. So
I'm glad we don't have to talk about it. Okay. So, but then the other thing that I want to talk about in the diamond approach is the sorry, it's the dogs are barking, and which I also want to talk about. But the Lataif.
mm,
Like one of the first things you learn in the diamond approach are the essential aspects, which are correlated with the Sufi Lataif. And so like the red Lataif and the yellow Lataif and the green Latifa. And so I'm curious, like what your knowledge or experience with that is.
mhm. Yeah, not a ton. So there's so many different kind of uh, methods and practices in Sufi lineages, and there's certainly many Sufi lineages throughout the Muslim world. So some of them have a bit more of kind of esoteric, occultist types of practices that are integrated. Others might be a bit more kind of closely tied with some of the kind of main liturgical sources for the Islamic tradition. Others of them have very embodied practices. Certainly, the dervishes in Maulana Rumi's Mevlevi Sufi order, but there's these Chechen Sufis that you maybe have seen some recordings of this Hadra practice where they're all jumping around, going in a circle real fast, and really kind of energetically reciting certain things. So, yeah, I can't say I've personally encountered some of this Latifa kind of schema, but yeah, it sounds very much like some kind of classic Sufi type of formulation for these spiritual yeah
Yeah. So that's one of those. That's the Hadra.
Hadra. Yeah. Yeah, that's I think a North African Sufi group. I have that very colorful kind of quilt-like garment. Can't remember exactly which order uses that, but yeah, interesting stuff. Very, very energetic, very embodied. Mhm.
Yeah. So, but in the diamond approach, it's like true nature. It's like these essential aspects are the sort of building blocks of true nature, of essential experience.
Mhm.
Um, that experience can become patterned by these qualities, these spiritual qualities, and it's sort of seen as very fundamental.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely see some strong parallels there with some major kind of formulations, especially within the more Neoplatonic and mystical uh, theologies in the history of the Islamic tradition. With you even have some Sufi cosmologies, metaphysics that are quite close to the Logos Christology type stuff in certain forms of Christianity. Here, instead, you have the Nur Muhammadiyah as the first creation, the Mohammedan light. So kind of the spiritual essence of Prophet Muhammad. So this is sort of the first and highest and most perfect creation of God. That then the whole of the rest of creation is sort of created for its sake. It's just so beautiful and full of splendor that God needed to go ahead and make a whole world just as kind of a dedication or devotion to this amazing creation. So yeah, pretty intensive stuff within the Islamic discourses. You have this word kalam, which many sort of Westerners familiar with sort of Christian theology may actually know this word. There's the famous kalam theological argument for the existence of God, but here in the Arabic, kalam means word. So very similar to kind of the connotation of logos here, and you have some of the same kind of theological metaphors of the word of God being this sort of creative process that existentiates various things, and they various created things have a specific kalimat, a specific kind of word that is their sort of real essence that again connects back to these divine names that are ontologically more real than sort of actual created material things in this kind of classic Neoplatonic framework. So yeah, very consonant with what I'm hearing from you about the diamond approach.
Cool, man. So one thing I'm curious about is I mean you seem kind of like wishy-washy about it. And it's a devotional path. And so like you really gotta, I mean, and you were just saying like you really gotta be devoted
Mhm.
in order to truly access some of these more advanced realizations and stuff. And but it is, I mean, especially when you're like a child of modernity, it's really hard to really engage some of these more traditional paths in a very devoted way. So, and Islam itself means submission, right?
Yep,
So you can't be partially submitted, you know? So I wonder if you say more about that.
for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I am totally in agreement with you. There's a certain level of commitment or skin in the game that really needs to happen in any kind of spiritual path to really open the doors to the kind of efficacy that the teachings have. It's also, I mean, it's a dangerous and tricky thing as I mean, you gotta sort of find a spiritual system and a teacher, but you're coming at that from uh, allegedly a place of sort of spiritual ignorance and naivete. If you already know all this stuff, why do you need a teacher? But there's also lots of bad systems out there, and sort of false gurus and all this stuff. So I mean, it's not a easy sort of path to undertake. There's
Yes.
some
Western,
real
right?
risk, and certainly the same applies within Sufi and Islamic frameworks. luckily, I think many of the sort of major traditional Sufi orders are very established and have really strong sorts of vetting mechanisms for teachers and practices that help mitigate some of that danger. And really, the this notion of divine law or Sharia, that is quite the kind of hot topic in the West. The whole purpose of that framework from the Sufi perspective is this sort of like strenuous sort of ethical conduct that you need to submit yourself to provide this like safe container and this like solid framework to then be ready to venture into some of these very destabilizing sorts of spiritual regions of the psyche of human experience, and doing that then, especially with a community, with a legit teacher. So yeah, just sort of my own biographical sort of where I'm at. I'm connected with many people involved in very traditional, legit Sufi orders. I have not personally taken an initiation into any of these groups, which you yourself need to be vetted by the sheikh, the spiritual leader of these orders, to be really invited in to become a disciple. So I certainly it's on the bucket list, but I know I'm sort of not at the spot where that commitment is going to kind of come naturally yet. And part of my kind of self understanding that's been developing the past while is well, I really am doing a lot in these sorts of philosophical arenas, thinking sort of religion in our day and age, and doing some of that kind of intellectual work, which is somewhat distinct from some of this spiritual path, this kind of experiential path that you go down of realization. Though these are certainly interrelated things. So if it turns out that my kind of mission on this earth is more in contributing to the philosophical kind of side of things, providing sort of healthier, more integrated and robust perspectives on what spirituality looks like in modernity, postmodernity, metamodernity. Who knows where we're at? That's okay with me. If it's that I'm not supposed to be this sort of deep mystic ascetic. We'll see what happens. I keep the door open, but I don't want to get attached to that identity prematurely, certainly. And I need to get rid of that attachment on the path anyway. So might as well preempt that to a degree.
Yeah. So do you have a relationship with Allah?
I don't typically think of it in that particular language, but certainly, I find some of that can be a little evangelical kind of vibes to really talk about this personal relationship with God.
Not
There,
necessarily personal, but like devotional.
sure. Yeah, definitely. There's, I mean, certainly any kind of traditional Islamic prayer practice is deeply devotional in that kind of that vein, as well as the kind of more particular Sufi spiritual practices of reciting these names of God and these kind of Quranic formulations, and in group and certainly individually as well.
I see. So let's talk about Nasser.
Okay, sure. the traditionalist school, René Guénon, kind of the first major figure, and then you have a number of traditionalist authors philosophers who come following him. Frithjof Schuon is maybe the most significant name in terms of some of his quote unquote disciples or successors. And then following Schuon is when Nasr kind of hits the scene. So he's kind of this third generation traditionalist in this lineage, and there's a direct sort of teacher student relationship from Guénon to Schuon to Nasr, and throughout this progression, you see a development of a bit more nuanced, I'll say, perspective on the West and modernity. With Guénon, you have a very kind of black and white essentialist metaphysical kind of understanding of the decadence of modernity in the West versus the traditionalist perspective. Schuon certainly carries that forth, but adds some nuance to some of these things, and kind of qualifies certain of Guénon's perspectives. So, for example, Schuon has an interesting take on the sort of development of the Protestant Reformation, and that there is a certain kind of real sapiential knowledge in Protestant Christianity, and I'm not sure if Guénon really had that perspective, or if he only saw the Reformation as kind of a step in this decadence of modernity. But I will say, even Nasr is very, very harsh on modernity.
Right.
And I think he would distinguish modernity from the West, because in the West you have Christianity, and there's certain forms of Christianity that he would consider entirely sort of authentic, and even as they themselves have experienced a higher degree of decadence than certain other non-Western forms of religion. But yeah, he has a quote, something like, in pre-modern times, sort of society, human civilization was essentially good, with sort of incidental evils, and in modernity it's the opposite, and modern society, civilization, is essentially bad or essentially evil. But of course, because of sort of grace and things like this, there's still a perspective that, okay, obviously it can't be totally bad, and some good things still happen, but it's not a necessary consequence of modernity. It's in spite of modernity that those goods can exist. So it's still a very, very harsh perspective, and
Right.
he's extremely dismissive of philosophers like Hegel, which I think is a little undue. I'm not super familiar with Hegelian thought, but I mean, certainly contributes to modernity and some of these perspectives we have. But I think he's a little too sort of ready to totally throw out any kind of more recent philosophical speculation. I think there's a lot of value in these systems. Heidegger, Hegel, all sorts of existentialists. So
Gotcha. Yeah, so that was my impression of some of the stuff I read of yours, was that you're not really interested in throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
yeah. So a little bit more context. So my Islamic Studies professor that I was mentioning at the outset, he was a student of Seyyed Hossein Nasr. And so he's, I guess, kind of this fourth generation traditionalist. And if I identify myself with this school, I'm perhaps a fifth generation in this lineage. And yeah, I'm certainly trying to I probably follow the Kyoto school a bit more on this topic than I do the traditionalists, where they are really drawing a lot on modern thought, especially some of these more existentialist kinds of thinkers, and really taking that very seriously. And trying to integrate that with these sort of traditional metaphysical perspectives. Both Zen and Christianity are really what they're working with, but trying to take a even more kind of pluralistic and cosmopolitan approach here. So yeah, I guess I mean the way to kind of formulate it in the kind of most generic sort of sense is well, the traditionalists very much think that with the advent of modernity, you have something sort of essentially negative that's happening here. And as Nasr says, of course there's still going to be positives here and there, but you can kind of throw out these whole slew of thinkers and try and return to tradition as the memes tell us. I guess I think that even within tradition, one finds a development of metaphysical thinking. So, for example, I mean, your shamanic, your animist types of indigenous traditions, they're very different from, say, Thomistic Christianity in the Middle Ages. Those are very different systems, and the traditionalist will maintain that there's some kind of core metaphysical continuity there, and that both of these traditions are going to have some kind of salvific or Gnostic efficacy, and sort of allowing for the realization of sincere seekers within those contexts. But I see a real development there. I see a development of sort of the existential situation of the human subjects within there, and the forms of thought that exist within those contexts. And so I think ultimately what it looks like to sort of have this kind of sapiential path within medieval Christianity versus shamanism is very different. And I think this kind of development of human consciousness and our existential situation continues in modernity and beyond, and that taking that seriously and thinking through how that impacts the kind of spirituality that works, I think is something we need to do. And I think purely trying to recreate sort of traditional religion in our era is going to be a task with a lot of tension and sort of unresolved conflict. And so I think that there's going to be some kind of renewed traditionalism that will have to integrate, say, Hegelian, Heideggerian, et cetera, these types of modern perspectives, because they're sort of in the kind of human beings that we have nowadays. And if you sort of actually get into that stuff, there is substance there. And I don't think you can just sort of cast that aside in any kind of crude way. And even if, say, a Platonic metaphysics is still entirely viable, I think you really need to have this more substantive integration to make that work. And so it's going to end up with I mean, reforming and sort of transforming the religions that we have. But I don't view that as a break with the past. But that's always been what's happening. These traditions have constantly been in some kind of evolution throughout their existence. So that's fine by me.
Yeah. It seems like there's a lot of these sort of postmodern right-wing bros who are really hungry for, the traditional but they don't want to abandon the comforts of modernity.
Right.
And there are no real like cultural escalators to, take us from here to there. And
Hmm.
so they're just all kind of like floundering around, and um yeah, they're hungry for something.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's nothing really available. And there's some efforts to create some new religions and stuff, but those are kind of silly too. And so it's
Yeah.
like it's like how does this kind of thing get created? And
Hmm.
I mean, the only like truly postmodern spiritual path I know of is the diamond approach.
Hmm.
Um, that is like a genuine logos. It is it's sort of it's a complete spiritual path. It's a mystical path that integrates that, it's sort of there's this really in the inner journey home, Almas talks about he has this really what he calls an appropriate vision, where it's like the West is redeemed and the ego is redeemed. It's a very redemptive vision. Like modernity and postmodernism as well. These are sort of seen as like stepping stones, um, rather than aberrations, like giant historical mistakes, which is how
Hmm.
a lot
Yeah.
of modern spiritual traditions, or maybe even just traditional spiritual traditions, look at the ego and look at modernity. But this is a much more redemptive vision. And so that's it's one of the things I really appreciate about it. And but I don't really know of anything else out there
Hmm.
that's and so it just seems like, I mean, I was a sort of a postmodern seeker for a while, where I was like, well, I'll study some Buddhism, and then I'll go over here and like, listen to this Neo Advaita guy,
Hmm.
and and just sort of um, um, a pluralistic approach. And then eventually, somehow, I stumbled into the diamond approach, where it's a much more holistic spiritual path, and it emphasizes both being a man of the world and a man of spirit. So so what else is out there?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the landscape is pretty limited as it currently exists. There's certainly sort of individual people or teachers or students that I think probably fit the bill in terms of their own kind of thinking or approach of being beyond a postmodern kind of spirituality or into a metamodern kind of perspective, if we want to use that term. But yeah, in terms of sort of institutional or kind of systematic stuff, I don't see a ton. My own intuition is that this is going to be something that is going to exist most fruitfully within existing frameworks, albeit updating those. So I
Yeah.
think I think your Sufi orders, your sort of Zen lineages, your monastic Catholic kinds of groups. I think they have the kinds of authentic spiritual resources that can't just be like created by some kind of autodidactic kind of teacher and somehow brought into the world. So I guess a lot of my work and my hope is kind of bringing then these modern, postmodern, and metamodern perspectives more holistically into these existing lineages, and then seeing what work a kind of integrated vision can do with that material and then the traditional material to get to some much more holistic kind of vision here, where it's gonna, I think, look at modernity and these kinds of things as having something positive within them, even as it sort of sees and acknowledges all of these kinds of very real negativities that exist here. So it abandons some of this kind of meta narrative of progress, but has this kind of sort of almost like teleological thinking to it, some kind of divine wisdom that is ushered in with our sort of experience of modernity. Because I mean, there's real new ways of knowing and seeing and being that have come with this historical development, and I think there's something there that we're kind of supposed to integrate that just wasn't available in previous historical epochs. But certainly we need a very sophisticated philosophical perspective to be able to effectively do that without sort of reifying things in kind of fatalistic ways that can be very harmful.
So can a postmodern or post-postmodern Islam coexist with a pre-modern Islam?
Yeah, that's the question, huh? And that's the question with all of these traditions, and I think it'll be a bit different depending on the specific tradition in question. Some of these traditions, kind of the heart of it at this point is like maybe a little modern. Like I'm thinking about like Unitarian Universalism. Like, oh, that's a very modern or even postmodern kind of spirituality. So like that might need to like integrate the traditional in a more substantive way to get to where it is. But yeah, in terms of the Islamic situation, I mean, this is what I think kind of long and hard about in a lot of ways. Like how can we take this tradition and bring to it these kinds of more contextualist, say, understandings of all sorts of stuff that I think is going to be necessary for kind of developing a more dynamic and flexible, adaptable spiritual perspective for where we're at, without sort of sacrificing some of this like intuitive sense of like sacredness and transcendence that exists within these sort of traditional forms, and more pragmatically, without alienating or pissing off the real traditionalists in the religion. So I mean, you can sort of come and say, oh, look at this sort of historicized understanding of the Hadith literature that is going to sort of allow for a less kind of literalistic approach to how this material is used for especially legal interpretation, sort of producing legal rulings about various topics. But just sort of doing that, well, you're going to get labeled a lib or a modernist like real quick, because there's a lot of reactivity around sort of coming in, trying to reform Islam to make it this more sort of able to kind of function in modernity kind of thing. You have a very sort of colonialist history that tried to do that very violently out of a sort of Eurocentric kind of perspective of this is some backward shit. We got to get these people up to the 20th century, 19th century sort of thing. So I mean, there's really good reasons why people are reactive there. But there's also some really, really pathological stuff that comes out of a certain attachment to a much more kind of literalist, kind of fundamentalist approach to the tradition that I think somehow we're going to need to get around. And I think there, certainly the Sufi traditions have a lot of traditional material that itself can sort of push back against some of that stuff. So we don't necessarily need to be bringing in sort of contemporary Western
Yeah, that's
philosophical
a good point.
stuff
And I know there's
to
a lot of suspicion about Sufism.
there is, yeah. So I mean, even that, which is interestingly partially a legacy of the colonial encounter. The sort of Orientalist scholars of these colonizing European nations really strongly tried to dissociate Sufism from the Islamic tradition more broadly, even though these are very closely sort of aligned phenomena historically. Sufi orders were typically very orthodox. A lot of the Sufi masters were also sort of jurists and trained in sort of the legal traditions of the religion and able to give rulings. The Sufis were certainly following the legal and theological orthodoxies. Yeah, a lot of this is kind of internalized Orientalist perspectives that have in interesting ways then aligned themselves with what you could call more kind of fundamentalist forms of the religion that developed under that colonial encounter period and remain quite prevalent and quite strong today. So I mean, it's a very big challenge, kind of coming to a more substantive integration within the Islamic world of these mystical perspectives of modern thought, scientific, rationalistic kind of thought, but then also postmodern kind of contextualist, perspectival stuff, and then throwing it all together and trying to get it into some kind of coherent framework. But on the flip side, one of the real positives of the sort of Islamic situation, certainly at least within the Sunni majority, is this is not a kind of you don't have denominations. There is still ultimately sort of a big tent unity here, even as Sunnism includes these Sufi mystics and these sort of Salafi leaning literalists and all these different kind of camps. They still go to the same mosques. They can pray together and sort of have this kind of unity that is not really sort of viable in sort of a Christian sort of context nowadays, with the constantly proliferating denominations that have kind of hard boundaries with one another. So the porousness that remains within the Sunni Islamic majority is something that makes me kind of hopeful in this regard.
Yeah, and now that they all have access to the internet and stuff, it's like we don't even know what effect that's going to have.
Right.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, like
Mm-hmm.
it has to have a modernizing effect. You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
so we're only like
Yeah.
one generation away from discovering its true impact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you have this sort of faction called Salafism within the Islamic scene that it's a sort of fundamentalist, literalist kind of movement. They're trying to go back to the pure sources of the religion, which for them means the Quran, but certainly the Sunnah, this body of hadith literature of sayings and stories of the Prophet Muhammad, and then also the sort of standards that the early community directly following and contemporary with the Prophet Muhammad sort of practiced. You already see that this perspective is sort of becoming a bit more moderate. I mean, it historically has been sort of pretty readily identified with these kind of violent jihadist movements in various ways. And nowadays, a lot of sort of political quietism in this group, and certainly Saudi Arabia is kind of the hotbed of this perspective, even as it's very, very global at this point. And Saudi Arabia is kind of as a government trying to moderate a bit more and become a bit more less extremist, a little more sort of amenable to global sort of norms for our era. So it's kind of encouraging in that regard. But at the same time, I think this movement didn't happen for sort of no reason. I think because of some of the complicated colonial dynamics where the sort of British sort of artificially kind of propped up this perspective because it was very advantageous to help them kind of gain control in the Arab Peninsula region. And then Saudi Arabia got all this oil money and was able to really fund the sort of global Salafization of the Islamic world with a lot of that oil money. So it has a lot of historical contingencies to it, but at the same time, the sort of classical Islamic tradition was sort of very complex, very elitist in a sense. Like there's tons of schooling to be able to sort of become a legal expert, and then you had to sort of defer to these legal experts in your communities for various disputes. And so it was very complex. It wasn't necessarily so accessible to the average person. And so this perspective comes along, says you have the Quran, you have the Hadith, sort of knock yourself out. Kind of, it's easy, it's readily available, and so there is some sort of legitimate kind of populist sensibility to it that I think is going to be necessary to integrate in whatever is coming next here. But ideally, shedding these kinds of literalist and puritanical impulses that kind of came along with that.
Gotcha. Jordan Peterson once described Muhammad as a warlord. And I think he sort of backpedaled on that. Mm-hmm. But what the hell is he talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a hot button question for sure. It has a lot of history to it, a lot of Orientalist and kind of Christian exceptionalist kind of stuff. I think the warlord language is very politicized in a certain way. But it's definitely true that Muhammad, as a prophetic figure, was engaged in sort of military ventures and was a political leader as well as being a sort of a spiritual teacher. For Muslims, this is totally a positive because here you have a sort of ideal that has worldly instantiation. So the Muslim understanding of Jesus, for example, who's also a prophet and very highly revered within the religion, is he was this sort of esoteric spiritual teacher. He came with all these sort of parables and lived this sort of incredible mystical life and really pointed to a spirituality that transcends the world in many ways. But that gives very, very little sort of direct examples of how to live. We are worldly beings, and it can be difficult to understand how to take this sort of Christic example and instantiate it in one's own life, in communities. Are we all supposed to go out and get martyred? Not sure. Not sure about that. So Muhammad is this more kind of synthetic figure. He does do war. He does do military stuff, but within the Orthodox perspective, he does it in the most sort of ethically upright and exemplary way that a human being could possibly do such things. And so it provides this more concrete touchstone for the religious believers, and this is where the Sharia comes from. Then it's like the Quran. It's kind of an aspirational document a bit. It has a lot of ideals and theological perspectives. It's a little light on sort of actual legal rulings, and so then you take the prophetic example of Muhammad, and from that material you have sort of the concrete instantiation of the Quranic spirituality. My own take is this has been a bit sort of literalist in its historical instantiation, and so you have a lot of trying to directly emulate the kind of exact sorts of actions from Muhammad and this early community, rather than kind of understanding in a bit more of a kind of a like a teleological sort of way, like what were they trying to sort of achieve, like what was the context here, and like what were they moving towards. So reading it that way, I think you get a bit more of a kind of progressive sort of slant to it, of like, okay, we're trying to pursue greater and greater justice. This is how that was available in this Arabian context in the 600s, and we will probably be doing it differently today, but we can kind of take this as a sort of aspirational touchstone for that.
I see. So eventually they'll have to take on kind of a stage model.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a good bit of potential there, and this is also somewhere I think that the process, theological and philosophical perspectives could contribute something to Islamic thinking, and there's a number of contemporary scholars trying to kind of realize that in different ways.
So say more about that. Like, how?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so where process thinking in Islam really goes back to is this guy, Muhammad Iqbal, who is this very interesting character. He was South Asian. Nowadays, we call him Pakistani, but this was at a time before Pakistan and India were separate nations. And he was interesting in that he was sort of Western educated to a certain extent, but also deeply engaged in the sort of traditional Islamic forms of learning. I don't believe he was classically trained in any of the Islamic sciences, but he was nonetheless really sort of engaged in some of these discourses, and he's drawing on Whitehead and Henri Bergson, and bringing some of their thought into conversation with kind of the whole gamut of Islamic intellectual history. He was also a poet, sort of a classical Muslim poet, one of the last, I think they often say. I think he wrote in either Urdu or Farsi. I think probably both. And he was also this sort of statesman. He is kind of credited as one of the founders of Pakistan. So it's kind of like if you threw like Nietzsche and Whitehead and Thomas Jefferson and Wordsworth and some like Thomas Merton all into a hat and kind of mixed them around. But anyway, he's got this big book, the Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, where he really kind of goes on a tour de force of trying to give a bit more of a updated perspective on the Islamic religion as a whole, and always keeping the Quran as a very sort of close touchstone going through that. So a lot of contemporary Islamic process thinking is going back to Iqbal and trying to further some of his perspectives and his project. But then there's also a bit more kind of independent Islamic process thinking going on, especially within the sphere of progressive Islam. And also, I mean, some of my own work is doing some of this more in the context of these Sufi Neoplatonic kinds of metaphysics, and trying to kind of take that as a bit of a springboard. And then there's a couple other projects here and there going on in kind of a little bit more niche segments of sort of Islamic intellectual history. But yeah, there's some interesting possibilities there for further developing these postmodern or post-postmodern kinds of perspectives within the tradition.
I see. So what do you see at what do you see process philosophy or the process thinking as adding to it specifically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think getting to a more constructive or evolutionary view of religion in general is probably like the most significant big picture change that I could see happening with an engagement with process thought. I mean, right now there's still very much, whether it's kind of this more Salafi puritanical kind of perspective, or just a classical Muslim perspective. I mean, there's very much a kind of reverence of the past, whether it's sort of tradition or these allegedly like pure sort of approaches to the original sources of scripture and such. But I just don't think that is sort of an effective or realistic kind of methodology. Ultimately, I don't think that the impact or the meaning of these things is always going to be sort of reproduced if you just kind of reproduce the same form. So, I mean, you look at the Quran, the Hadith, the classical tradition, you got slavery. You have a number of important sort of ethical constraints about what you can do in the sort of master-slave relationship. But I think we just don't want slavery. I think we are at a point where that's certainly no longer an institution we would like in human life. And I think we have alternatives that can sort of achieve what slavery achieved in classical periods. And so instead of saying, well, we got slavery in in this classical tradition and these sacred sources, so we're keeping it around, we can look at sort of the aims of these traditions and of these sort of scriptural sources, and see what they're trying to sort of move humanity towards, and how that's instantiated in different eras, in different contexts, is going to look different. So it forces you to think a bit more contextualist, and I mean, it's intellectually a more difficult task if you just have to sort of reproduce these conditions that you can identify in a tradition. It's very easy, you just do this. It's very mechanical in a sense. But getting beyond that and having this more sort of, okay, we got to really rethink for all these issues the kind of foundational, like the point of it, what are we trying to achieve here? And I mean, beyond that, there are certain theologies in sort of traditional Islamic context that very much promote a kind of theological thinking where very much kind of divine command theory. It's like, well, these are the laws. They're written clearly. This is exactly what's meant to happen. If you don't think that seems good, well, God is just this source of all goodness. So that's like on you. And because this law is from God, that makes it good. It's not about the impact. It's not about the sort of effect of what this instantiating this sort of legal ruling does. That's irrelevant to this kind of theology, since It's all good comes from God, so it's not how you judge things, and so it's sort of a human fault to see things from that perspective. But so I mean, process is helpful there too in sort of providing a different kind of theological framework that wouldn't have God be sort of morally incomprehensible. The process theological perspective is going to have sort of the goodness of God as being like sort of the tantamount thing, and it's going to be sort of comprehensible goodness, and even if that sort of impinges on sort of traditional notions of omnipotence, that's going to be kind of what is preserved is this idea of some kind of divine goodness or compassion. And I think that fits well, frankly, with the basic sources of Islamic theological thinking. You have every single verse of the Quran start with this proclamation, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. I think by starting every single thing that allegedly comes from God with that framing, I think it's kind of trying to tune you in to that as sort of the most foundational sort of aspect that can be identified here. So I think there's sort of ways within the tradition you can kind of get around some of this stuff, but it's certainly complicated. It's certainly complicated.
It is complicated. So I think we've been going for a couple hours here.
Yeah, it's been a bit.
Yeah, so I found this all very fascinating, and appreciate you coming on and talking to me.
Yeah, for sure. Always fun stuff to dig into some of these issues, and I was happy to hear a bit more about the diamond approach. That's mostly material I haven't explored yet, so good to learn.
Yeah, man, check it out. I think you'll like it.